Good morning. Bonjour, tout le monde. I think we will start. We'll start. Donc, bienvenue à toutes et à tous. Welcome to this interdisciplinary research laboratory on the rights of the child, LRIDE's conference. I will start with the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, young and old. We honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. And so today we will hear from a research project. Last year we did already hear about this research project, and today it's a different aspect of it. It's about hearing children's views in the context of aggression towards families and caregivers in childhood and adolescence in Canada. And so we have here Christine Gervais, Elisa Romano, who are professors who've been with the Child Rights Lab for many years and are active participants and have been and are also, for Christine, currently members of the lab steering committee. So Christine Gervais, who's professor at the Department of Criminology, and Elisa Romano from the School of Psychology. And we also have here Danica DiCarlo Slobodnik, who has been working on this project with the two professors, who's a graduate of a master's in criminology and a former MITAC's research intern. So it's great to have the three of you here to tell us about young persons' reflections on their rights as children in this context of aggression within family, which is a project that you have been doing a lot of research on, and that's funded by MITACs and the Kids Brain and Health Network. So, this is it's one of our, we organize 3 or 4 lunchtime conferences per year, and this is our last one for this year, and it also falls within the conference cycle of the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law Civil Law section. So it's done in partnership with the Civil Law section. So thank you to everybody, and I think I will let you start right away. So you present your projects, you'll present young person's reflections, and then we'll have time for questions, the discussion with the audience.
Thank you, Mona, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Interdisciplinary Research Laboratory on the Rights of the Child within the Faculty of Law for hosting this event and providing the initial financial support for the study upon which today's presentation is based. Before we forget, we want to acknowledge Caroline Fauché, who is the Communications and Events Management Officer with the Human Rights Research and Education Center in the Faculty of Law, for her development, first of creative promotional materials for this event, as well as for her invaluable IT support. We're very grateful for her thoughtfulness and attentiveness. We also acknowledge, as Mona mentioned earlier, the funding granted through the MITACs Accelerate program, as well as the Kids Brain Health Network and the Adopt for Life organization, all of which supported the research internship held by Danica DiCarlo Slobodnik. And we also thank the staff and volunteer members from the National Consortium on APFEA and Adopt for Life for having inspired and in many ways prompted us to develop the pilot study and now this extended research that considers young people's experiences. We also thank all those who assisted us with recruitment through their various networks across the country. We certainly couldn't have completed this project without you, so we're very grateful. We especially wish to thank the young people who gave generously of their time and shared profound insights of very difficult personal circumstances, some of which you'll hear about today. I'm joined today by Danica DeCarlo Slobodnik, who as the intern was really this project's lead researcher. And she'll be introducing the main aspects of the study, including the methods, as well as the participants and their perceptions of APFEA in the context, especially of their rights to be heard. I'm also joined, as Mona introduced, Dr. Elisa Romano, who is a co-investigator on both studies. And in the first part of the presentation, she'll be highlighting the demographic information, some of the relevant diagnoses, and in the latter part, she'll be concluding the presentation by sharing some of the recommendations that were based on young people's insights. And in between Danica and Elisa, I will be presenting on the impacts of APFEA and on the considerations of children's best interests and young people's rights to support, as well as some of their exemplary forms of resilience. But before we begin, and this will go to the next slide, as a point of clarification about the term APFEA itself, we wanted to note that in recent decades and across multiple countries, aggression that's exhibited by children and adolescents towards their parents has been variously described by scholars and practitioners, including, for example, adolescent to parent violence, so known as APV, or adolescent to parent abuse, known as APA, or child to parent violence and abuse, known as CPVA. But such definitional differences have really led to a varied literature base, as well as to many limitations for appropriate interventions. And it was those limitations that in mind that in 2021, the National Consortium on APFEA in Canada sought to develop a more comprehensive term in order to minimize the lack of consensus over the terminology itself, and especially to limit the potentially stigmatizing implications of the descriptors on the affected children and youth. So the National Consortium's consultation process led to the behavior being renamed as aggression toward family, caregivers, and childhood and adolescents, with the acronym APFEA, as we're referring to it. And it was subsequently redefined as a pattern of behavior in childhood or adolescence characterized by aggressive behavior by a child or adolescent toward family members or caregivers. So in a few moments, we'll describe more specifically what that behavior entails, at least as it was shared to us by the young people within the study. But in the meantime, we think that it's also important to clarify that the main impetus of our broader research on APFEA in Canada is a recognition that APFEA leads to a significant number of physical and psychological and emotional harms. First, for the children or adolescents demonstrating the aggression. Secondly, for the person or people towards whom the aggression is directed. And thirdly, for other family members who may witness it. And despite its extensive impacts, there's been limited research, especially in Canada, that considers the experiences of children and teens who are impacted by APFEA, either as demonstrators of the aggression or as siblings of demonstrators. We'll move to the, thank you, Danica. So given this limited research in the Canadian context, we conducted the pilot study, as Mona referred to earlier, between 2021 and 2022 in order to document the frequency, the extent, as well as the impact of APFEA in Canada, based primarily on the reflections and experiences of kinship, adoptive or customary caregivers and parents. And some of the results of that study were published last fall in the Canadian Journal on Children's Rights. And they were also featured, as Mona mentioned as well, in a Noon Hour series presentation similar to today's, was held last spring, and the recording of which is available on the LRIDE's web page on the University of Ottawa's website. So last year in 2022, following the completion of the pilot study with parents, we initiated a research project that centered young persons' voices and shed light on their experiences of APFEA, both as demonstrators as well as siblings of demonstrators. And as mentioned already, it was the studies with young persons in particular that was funded by the MyTax Accelerate program in conjunction with the Kids Brain Health Network, as well as Adopt Your Life. So these are the results, or part of the results that were being featured in today's presentation. So over to you, Danica.
Thank you, Christine. So the main goal of the 2022 research was to identify the social, emotional, and mental health needs of young people impacted by APFEA from a children's rights and trauma-informed perspective. So this study utilized mixed methods of surveys and interviews. Our sample was made up of two main groups: young adults who demonstrated aggression toward their family as children or adolescents, and siblings of those who demonstrated aggression toward family as a child or adolescent. So in online surveys, participants were asked about their own or their siblings' aggression, where they felt it came from, and its impacts. We had 62 participants in our survey sample, 35 of whom were demonstrators and 27 siblings of demonstrators. And then along with the surveys, we utilized interviews where participants were given more space to share about their rights as children to expression and being heard, as well as their rights to treatment and protection. We conducted 9 interviews, 6 with siblings and 3 with demonstrators. And I'll just pass it to Elisa to discuss the demographics.
Thank you, Danica. So what we see in this slide is that for demonstrators, almost half identified as male, followed by 43% who identified as female. And there also were respondents who identified as non-binary, two-spirit, and cisgender. For siblings of demonstrators, the majority, 63%, identified as female, followed by 1/3 who identified as male, and 4% who identified as non-binary. Turning to the age of survey respondents, a little over half were in the 22 to 26 year age range, with about 1/3 falling in the 18 to 21 year age range. And the remaining respondents were between 27 and 30 years of age. This map shows the concentration of survey respondents across Canada. Most were located in Ontario, with 46% of APFEA demonstrators and 48% of siblings. And this was followed by British Columbia, where we received survey responses from 29% of young people who demonstrated APFEA and 19% of sibling of demonstrators. And the remaining responses were spread across the rest of Canada.
So now we'll move on to some of the self-reported characteristics of APFEA based on demonstrators' reflections and responses. In surveys and interviews, demonstrators of APFEA were asked a series of closed and open-ended questions about their behavior, where they felt it came from, and its impacts. So in both surveys and interviews, verbal forms of aggression were most common, but physical and emotional displays of aggression were also reported by demonstrators. As we can see on this bar graph, verbally insulting or yelling was most commonly reported by 28% of survey respondents. Trying to impact my parents in ways that could hurt them was reported by 21% of respondents, and damaging objects by 20%. So I'll just leave that up for a moment so you can take a look. Participants indicated that their aggressive behaviors were most often directed towards mothers, and that was 80%, siblings, 74%, and fathers, 60%. Although caregivers and other extended family members, friends, peers, and professionals were also reported as targets, as we can see on the bar graph. Most often, incidents were reported to have occurred inside the home, although there were occasions when they were said to have happened elsewhere, but this was less common. Demonstrators of APFEA identified a wide range of ages when the behavior began. The median age of onset for APFEA was 10 years old. 17% of respondents indicated that behavior began at age 10. Another 17% indicated it began at age 15, 14% at age 5, and as we can see, the others are dispersed among the other numbers. We asked participants about whether their aggression continued into adulthood. More than half of survey participants said yes, their aggression continued into adulthood, and 46% indicated that they no longer engaged in aggressive behaviors toward family. Behaviors were most often reported to have decreased between 15 to 23 years of age. When asked why aggression stopped or decreased, participants often discussed a change in home situations when the demonstrator of APFEA or the sibling of the demonstrator left home or ended contact with family members. These changes seem to be positive in young people's lives because of the adverse experiences they faced as children. As one participant noted, I moved away from home and was able to deal with my emotions on my own and on my own time. The main reason for my aggression was a sexual assault I had experienced by a family member, and I was having a lot of trouble dealing with it, especially with feelings of anger. After moving out and away from this person, it helped a lot. Anecdotal evidence from past research and from this study show that many demonstrators of APFEA experience adversity in their childhoods. Experiences of abuse and other trauma, disruptions in permanency, and developmental disorders were commonly discussed by the participants in this study and are reflected as risk factors for APFEA in existing research. So these survey participants also pointed to behavioral changes that they said were supported by therapy, medication, new outlooks on life, and finding alternative emotional outlets or learning how to deal with emotions. I spoke to a therapist, I started taking medication and I was able to control my anger or sadness. And another said therapy and minimal contact, any contact at my discretion, working on mental health and outlook on life, coming to terms that what's done is done and I can't change it. So just acceptance and being the person I know I can be. So when asked about reasons for aggressive behavior, demonstrators of APFEA and siblings of demonstrators spoke about intersecting factors that exist across individual, family, and social or systemic levels. They shared about their own or their siblings' childhood, adoption and intergenerational trauma, family breakdown, various diagnoses, parenting styles, mental health, and lack of social support. APFEA seemed to be both a response to and a coping mechanism for complex experiences of adversity. Research supports the finding that variables related to individual, family, cultural, and social factors are associated with APFEA. The quote on this slide from a participant in Quebec points to a combination of factors that they felt contributed to their behavior as a child and their struggles into adulthood. They said, my mom was a single mom, so we never had like another parent or anything like that. And we were 4 adopted kids with different family backgrounds and different disabilities and stuff. So my mom was always very stressed. We were pretty poor on social assistance. That was the family situation. And now I know that all of that stuff really impacted our dynamics and my own behaviors. So in addition to the factors outlined in this quote, this participant shared about their adoptive mother's mental health struggles, the lack of support their family received from the Provincial Child Welfare Agency, and the trauma of their adoption.
Demonstrators of APFEA, as well as their siblings, reported on various mental health issues and diagnoses, along with coping difficulties that seem to contribute to aggressive behaviors. On the survey, respondents were given the option of providing details about their backgrounds and any diagnoses. Respondents noted various singular and co-occurring diagnoses that included anxiety and generalized anxiety disorder, autism and possible autism spectrum disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, bipolar disorder, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and borderline personality disorder. In the interviews, some participants also spoke about these similar diagnoses in relation to the demonstration of aggressive behavior. While participants shared the difficulties that they experienced on an individual level, It was clear that such struggles stemmed from familial and environmental factors related to trauma and adversity. And although participants were not required to provide details about their backgrounds, some chose to speak about their histories of adoption, their experiences of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and the family breakdowns and instability they faced in their biological, adoptive, kinship, and foster homes. All 4 of the interview participants who had demonstrated APFEA identified past traumas and adversities that included abuse, intergenerational trauma, the death of immediate family members, entry into the child welfare system, and adoption. Some siblings also spoke about traumatic experiences and past difficult events when asked why they felt their sibling demonstrated aggression toward caregivers and family members. The information that was provided by demonstrators of APFEA and their siblings, be it through the survey or the interview, is really aligned with past research, showing that child maltreatment and adversity more generally often impact young people's development when it comes to attachment relationships and their ability to cope with stress and manage difficult feelings, all of which can then increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior. Danica?
Yeah, sure. We can do this. Although aggression toward caregivers and family members occurs in all types of families, young people in adoptive homes may be more vulnerable because of their trauma histories. Participants who were adopted often shared feelings of pain, loss of identity, or confusion related to the process of adoption. These experiences seem to contribute to displays of APFEA. In the quote on this slide, this past demonstrator discussed the trauma of her adoption as a contributing factor in her aggressive behavior. She said, I guess I was trying to communicate that I was in a lot of distress, that I was in a lot of emotional pain and very confused. There's a lot of things going on thinking back on it because of the trauma of my adoption, not knowing about my birth culture and things like that. A majority of siblings who participated in this study were biologically related to the demonstrators of APFEA, the demonstrator of APFEA, and that was 52%. 41% said their sibling was adopted, and 7% had foster siblings. All 3 demonstrators who were interviewed, as well as some siblings, spoke about adoption breakdown, kinship placements, foster homes, and group homes or institutional care setting placements. There is evidence that children who experience a greater number of moves in care and delayed entry into long-term care are at greater risk for emotional and behavioral difficulties and tend to have poorer outcomes. We asked participants what was happening for them during difficult moments as children or teens. These quotes from past demonstrators of APFEA demonstrate that aggressive behavior often served as a way of communicating difficult feelings which were often overwhelming and related to anger, isolation, and not feeling heard or protected. I would shut down essentially. I didn't care what was happening because I felt like no one cared about me. Another participant said, I was like really overwhelmed and didn't know how to cope and deal with the stuff I was feeling. And another said yelling was the only thing I knew to do to release my anger. This study explored how participants experienced or did not experience their rights as children. There was a focus on rights to expression and being heard, as well as rights to treatment and support. So we'll begin with the former. Under Articles 12 and 13 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, children are capable of forming their own views, and they have the right to express those views freely in ways that are taken seriously. They also have the right to express themselves by seeking, receiving, and communicating information. The young people who participated in this study were asked whether they felt heard by their parents or caregivers during moments of conflict and more generally overall. 3 demonstrators who were interviewed, as well as some survey respondents, shared about the lack of understanding they felt from their parents or caregivers. When family members did not attempt to uncover the underlying cause of aggression, participants were more likely to shut down and feel alone and misunderstood, which in turn would lead to more challenging behaviors. As one participant explained, I felt like the automatic reaction was usually anger rather than trying to understand. Although the participants identified many counterproductive ways in which parents or caregivers responded to their aggression, they also pointed to their own varying capacities to communicate effectively as being aggravating factors for challenging behaviors. As the quote here demonstrates, "When I don't feel my voice is heard, it makes me angry, as anyone would be. But I didn't have the coping mechanisms to realize why I was feeling how I was feeling and acting how I was acting." By acknowledging their varying capacities to cope, they identify areas where they require support and really their needs for support related to understanding and managing difficult feelings and learning to communicate those feelings. Siblings also reflected on their brother, sister, or sibling's ability to communicate and cope with the emotions they feel. The sibling quoted here reflected on her sister's challenges with expression. "I think my sister feels emotions very, very strongly. So when it's anger, she doesn't know how to process that or, how to express it in a non-destructive way." Again, a need is being highlighted related to coping and communication. While there were many instances where children's rights to expression and being heard were not fulfilled, positive moments were shared at times. The participant quoted here experienced trauma stemming from abuse and grief while there were no instances where her family of origin made her feel heard. She did share about her friend's parents listening to her story and validating the struggles that she had experienced. She said, "I did feel heard with my friend's parents. They listened to every word that left my mouth and they didn't actually say anything. They didn't try to offer advice. They just sat me down at their table and they said, 'Spill,' and I told them everything. In the end, they pretty much said, 'I'm sorry that happened to you. I don't know how we can fix this, but we are here for you. We love you. We want to hear what's going on.'" Siblings also shared about the helpful ways in which their parents listened to the young person in their family who demonstrated APFEA. The sibling quoted here on the left discussed strategies that their parents employed to understand the underlying causes of aggression and to communicate in ways that aligned with the capacities of the young person showing aggression. They said they were trying to find the root cause of why is this happening? And like a therapist, they would walk him through it until he discovered it himself. Another sibling on the right here discussed how his mother uses a stuffed animal to communicate with his sister who has autism. By pretending that the toy is speaking, his sister seemed more able to communicate, understand, and regulate. These siblings and others pointed to their parents' awareness of children's nonverbal cues and capacities to communicate and regulate, as well as certain strategies that reflect such an awareness. And I will just pass it over now to Christine to discuss the impacts.
Thank you, Danica. Yes, so turning to consequences, participants identified a range of negative impacts resulting from APFEA on their day-to-day functioning and well-being. And in particular, demonstrators shared that challenging behaviors often led to them feeling alone, abandoned, and exhausted. Self-harm and drug use were also discussed by some demonstrators, as well as siblings, as a means of coping with the difficulties related to APFEA, as well as to past adversity. Survey respondents also reported that APFEA negatively impacted all family members and the relationships between family members. And of note, aggression was reported to have significant impacts on siblings' safety, on siblings' self-esteem, on siblings' sense of self or sense of personal boundaries, as well as their ability to express themselves. We also asked participants about the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for those who continue to show aggression into adulthood, or at least young adulthood, the COVID-19 pandemic was said to have had a negative impact on behavior and on young people's access to support, as well as treatment as adults. And as with many, if not all families during the pandemic, those restrictions, the health restrictions, impacted children and adolescents' mobility, which sometimes led to heightened tensions between the demonstrators of APFEA and their relatives. So one sibling from Ontario talked about his younger brother's challenges with adjusting to pandemic-related health restrictions and more time at home as a result. And he clarified how he wouldn't be able to just go out or hang out with someone when he's wanted to. It's been very, very hard on him. And although they were no longer children and adolescents at the time of their participation in the interviews or the surveys, we wondered whether the pandemic impacted their behavior if indeed they did continue to demonstrate aggression into adulthood. And actually 14% of survey participants who were demonstrators of APFEA said that their aggressive behavior had stayed the same, while 50% reported that it had gotten worse since the start of the pandemic. And among those for whom it became worse, a past demonstrator of APFEA from British Columbia discussed how the pandemic and health regulations created challenges for her, particularly in light of the impacts on service provision. And although virtual support is increasingly utilized today, she explained how the delay in shifting to alternative formats of care impacted her well-being, her relationship, and her family as an adult. And in this light, she disclosed a pandemic-related setback. She shared that it cut me off from my therapist for almost 6 months, and I ended up having some regressive moments during that time. So her experience certainly points to the need for ongoing support for those affected by APFEA, given how they may continue to be impacted by individual and collective stressors into adulthood. So turning to balancing best interests, although the best interests of all children in the home must be balanced and prioritized according to Article 3 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, the insights conveyed by siblings in particular point to how their voices and needs felt secondary at times. And siblings in particular discussed the unequal access they had or felt they had to their rights when their parents were drained or overwhelmed with the needs of their brother or sister who demonstrated APFEA. So one sibling said that during the pandemic, after she was laid off, I was in a really, really bad place, but my mom straight up could not support me emotionally for more than half of it, because she was just so drained from my sister, and that's never happened before. Another sibling explained that he does take like a lot of energy from people in the family. So as my mom explains it, like she spends all her energy trying to make sure he's okay, and like there's very little energy for me. So she's sorry if like she can't do stuff with me. So such perspectives by siblings clearly point to the collateral consequences that they face as a result of their brother or sister's aggressive behavior. And such consequences are evidently extended due to the interrelated consequences or challenges that parents must navigate as they consider all of the affected children's best interests. So in addition to children's rights to expression and to be heard that Dan covered a few moments ago, our study also explored children's rights to treatment and supportive responses. So this emphasis is in keeping with Article 40 of the CRC, which recognizes that regardless of behavior, including harms against others, as well as harms against children, children and adolescents have a right to support, to treatment, as well as to protection, and that such approaches should be prioritized however possible, rather than resorting to either judicial proceedings or institutional responses, including punishment or even incarceration. So those who demonstrated APFEA and siblings have demonstrated reported a range of perceptions related to feeling supported and protected. So this bar graph here shows how demonstrators who responded to the survey felt about the statement. I feel like my parents support me or have supported me in helpful ways. And as we can see here, a range of perceptions were captured among the responses. So while the majority, which was 26%, somewhat agreed, overall 20% either agreed or strongly agreed. Several respondents 40% specifically disagreed. And so they disagreed either somewhat strongly or generally. And they communicated that they didn't feel supported enough by their parents. So the fact that in total 40% reported that they didn't feel supported may be indicative of how, for one, the young people are not feeling understood and that their needs are not being met. And secondly, and interrelatedly, that parents or caregivers may be struggling with how to support their child or adolescent affected by APFEA. So in interviews, participants shared details about how their need for support was often not met. And based on the participants' experiences, their right to support was limited or seemed to be limited for a variety of reasons, including an overall lack of awareness of children's rights from parents, as well as child welfare professionals or practitioners, gaps in the provision of trauma-informed services. They were also related, or at least reportedly related, to parental feelings of shame and fear, as well as financial costs that prevented them from seeking out support. And so when asked what they wished would have happened differently when they hadn't felt protected, the interview participants discussed how they wished that parents would have first listened to them and their needs, secondly, given them space to express their feelings, and thirdly, understanding that their behaviors were stemming from factors related to trauma or their diagnoses and their varying capacities and abilities to cope and to communicate. So despite the seriousness of the impacts identified by both demonstrators and siblings and the challenges posed especially by the COVID-19 pandemic, participants still exhibited inspiring instances of resilience in the face of adversity. So one participant who demonstrated APFEA as a young person spoke about how, as an adult, she now parents her son who began to show aggression as well. She reported that she makes a concerted effort to very intentionally listen to him and to respond in gentle ways, even when it's difficult, because she feels the need to break the cycle of intergenerational trauma and to leave him with much better experiences than the ones that she had. Other demonstrators of APFEA also pointed to their own personal growth and attempts to heal. This is our last highlight here on resilience. Some siblings who participated also spoke about how they learned to establish and maintain boundaries even when it felt difficult. And others discussed their hopes for the future, which for two participants actually included studying to become support professionals. And occasionally, and I think quite interestingly, as a finding of this study, siblings identified, and often with a sense of pride and a sense of hope, some of the positive steps that their brothers or sisters were taking in relation to their aggression. There were also powerful attempts to frame adversity in positive ways, as is evidenced by this quote. "I feel like it's made me a much more compassionate person because, like, I'm always very aware that people have depth and there's always going to be something going on to explain why they're behaving the way they are. I think I may err on the side of being too forgiving, but I think if someone wrongs me, I'm not just going to be angry at them. I'll look for the reasons why." So now over to Elisa, who will highlight the youth-informed recommendations.
Thank you. When the young adults in this study shared their experiences with APFEA, as well as its impacts within the context of their well-being, family relationships, and rights, they pointed us to key recommendations that we need to implement to support the developmental, health, and relational needs of children and adolescents who demonstrate or witness APFEA. Here are 4 that we wish to highlight based on the voices of young adults from the study and also from past work completed in this area. When asked what they needed for support while growing up, participants spoke about the importance of therapists, support workers, and allied professionals who understand trauma and adversity, and the role that various forms of trauma play in shaping behaviors and relationships. Participants also pointed to their need as children and adolescents to learn skills related to communication and coping. Some participants spoke about the hurt associated with not feeling heard by adults, be they caregivers or professionals. And some participants shared their positive experiences when they expressed their feelings and thoughts and felt validated and listened to. What the young people communicated to us is well aligned with trauma-informed and responsive interactions. Namely, they spoke about the importance of adults understanding the impacts of trauma and childhood adversity, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma, digging deeper to understand the causes of a behavior, creating a sense of physical and emotional safety, and responding sensitively to behavioral expressions of trauma by staying connected and helping the young person cope with difficult feelings. Findings from this study also highlighted the critical importance of peer support for all family members. Such supports help build connections and understanding, and peer support can combat feelings of isolation and hopelessness, and it can provide a safe space in which to exchange ideas and best practices for handling challenging situations related to APFEA. Providing respite is an important form of support for families. Parents and caregivers play a critical role within families, and their well-being and health needs also must be prioritized so that they feel supported, well-rested, and physically as well as emotionally available to look after the best interests of all children in the home. Finally, the participants in the study spoke about the importance of having their voices heard and their experiences validated by both parents and professionals. This is illustrated in the quote here by a participant from British Columbia who said, "Children understand a lot more than we give them credit for, and they need to be heard." As such, one recommendation is to promote the awareness, understanding, and the use of child rights-based approaches. A child rights-based approach that centers the voices and experiences of young people is, in essence, a trauma-informed and responsive approach as well, because it fosters safety and commitment to really understand what might be going on for a young person.
Thank you, Elisa. And I'll just say in ending off here that we would really like to thank the participants who chose to share with us for the purposes of this research, which relied heavily on a children's rights-based approach. We're so grateful for their time and energy and sharing what they did. It was really important to us to explore their experiences of children's rights and really respect children's rights to be heard. Although they were not children or adolescents at the time of the surveys and interviews, we wanted to, you could say, retroactively respect those rights and give them the space to share with us in ways that were given weight. Thank you very much to everyone who attended today, and thank you to Christine and Elisa for all of their work on these projects as well. I've learned so much, if I can just say quickly, and I'm inspired by the work that you both do in the realm of children's rights. I will also briefly mention that the full community report and a summary poster of this study are available to view and download on Adopt for Life's website in both English and French. So we encourage you to take a look if you're interested. I will paste those links in the chat. Yes, and I think we'll take questions now, I believe, if there are any.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much for that presentation. Like, I think this is very important work, and it's just really good to bringing a child rights-based approach to such a sensitive issue and multidimensional as well, because it can seem kind of a simple thing. There's aggression, and how do you but clearly you've heard from different people who are affected or involved in this, and you've shown how it's important to hear from everybody. And now I'll go to the chat to see what kind of questions we have there. There's one question. Could you please comment on how the participants were found? Okay, yes, so that's about your methodology there. How did you recruit participants? I don't know who wants to answer. Danica, yeah.
And I think there were a couple questions just earlier on as well, which we can maybe go back to.
Okay, yeah, well, okay. Well, why don't you start with the recruitment? That's probably an easy question, and I'll go and read the earlier questions.
Yeah, so we recruited across Canada. We definitely relied on our partner organizations and their connections and their networks. So we did our best to really try to reach the sample and the kind of target population that we wanted to reach, which was not necessarily, this is not a great word, but easy, because it's an issue that sometimes people don't know about necessarily. But we had a lot of recruitment partners through Adopt for Life as well, who shared the material, and then community agencies that knew about this issue as well. And then we reached out to anyone else who might know about it. And it was shared by the interdisciplinary lab as well, through social media. I'm not sure, Christine, if you want to add anything else.
Not necessarily. I think you covered it. But I think in what I could add is that the recruitment occurred during somewhat of a challenging time, not only with the ongoing pandemic, and that obviously presented barriers in a variety of ways, although it created other opportunities for greater accessibility, for interviews to be conducted online, as we've all witnessed over the last few years. So a combination of barriers as well as wider accessibility. The study was also taking place during the spring and summertime, so there's a holiday period. So I think it's important to recognize that despite that phase and in a time when many people are away on vacation, there were a lot of supports provided to us by individuals who were quite dedicated to this particular issue, and made a concerted effort to disseminate the recruitment flyers and information on social media and so on. So again, we're really grateful to all those who supported us in that endeavor.
There's a related question. Did you originally expect larger numbers of survey participants and interviewees? And how does that volume compare to other similar studies? Like, were those your target numbers, or were you hoping for much larger? Well, how was that?
Yeah. So I think we were definitely hoping for larger numbers. We weren't sure though, because it is, like I said, something that is not, it's something that maybe people don't necessarily have. It's getting better now, but a huge awareness of, or don't necessarily have a name for it. So just trying to reach people who kind of were eligible and who are dealing with these issues or have dealt with these issues in the past as children or adolescents was a challenge in itself. And like Christine said, that I think the timing, the kind of spring, summer. So it was definitely, we didn't reach the numbers that we would have liked to reach, but still with what we had, we definitely, we learned a lot, and we're still very grateful for the numbers that we did have, but definitely not as many as we had originally kind of targeted or hoped for.
Yeah, and I know that's usually the case. It is really difficult to recruit participants, especially that kind of research that is, might be sensitive topics. It might be hard for people to come forward and talk about those things well.
If I can just add to that as well, and I think this speaks to what you just mentioned, Mona, in terms of the sensitivity of the topic and how challenging it is for individuals to share. about those experiences. So there were a higher number of survey participants for sure. And among those, many had expressed an interest in an interview. And when Danica made arrangements to follow up and to set up the interview, sometimes there was a initial correspondence and then not necessarily a full follow through. So I think that spoke to the concerns related to, so there was an interest in participating in interviews perhaps, but then possibly some individuals feeling less comfortable doing so in the end. So there was again, more communication and more efforts that were made and more willingness, at least at the outset. But in the end, there were some who didn't end up participating at the scheduled time of their interviews. And understandably so.
Yeah. There was another question from the same person there about the slide of the targets of APFEA there in your presentation. To your knowledge, were those numbers very different from what they would be before or after the pandemic?
Yeah, so for the targets of aggression, we didn't actually ask that a specific question of, who were the targets before the pandemic and who were the targets after the pandemic. So we don't actually have responses or I suppose data on that specific question. I think what we learned though from this study, and definitely from the pilot study as well, the last study, was that especially for families who are still dealing with this, the pandemic has definitely aggravated things for a lot of families. Yeah, so although we don't necessarily have specific statistics or questions that can speak to that for this study, it's definitely something that we notice. You spend more time at home for sure. So the targets, although we don't have specific kind of data to speak to that, it's definitely, we see in the interviews and everything in both studies that it's been something that's difficult during the pandemic, and incidents happen more for sure, especially in the last study. So I'm not sure if that kind of answers things without exactly answering it.
Yep, there was a thank you note about that answer. Then there was a question again about participants. So this was about their, just a moment. This was about the fact that you interviewed mostly participants who'd become adults, who'd been in these situations as they were younger, and wondering if you have any sense of if and how it might have been different to actually interview children.
Sure. So I think because it's such a, like Christine said as well, a very sensitive topic, something that's not necessarily easy to talk about, or yeah, I think this was kind of, it helped to have this almost entryway into that children's rights perspective with participants who could kind of retroactively look back and take a look at things with as some time had passed. It would definitely be, I think, and I think I speak for Christine and Elisa as well, important to have that perspective as well, given children's rights to expression and being heard. I think that was just kind of one step further, and is just at that point for this study, it was more feasible and kind of, given all the ethical considerations that would really have to be thought through, this was kind of the best way forward to kind of get a glimpse into children's rights almost retroactively, like I said. So, but that would be definitely a direction for future research. I'm not sure, Christine, if you wanted to add, or Lisa, anything to that. Perhaps how it would have been different.
Well, I think we would have probably captured feedback or examples that were, again, a little closer to home, or probably still quite prevalent in the lives of the young people. And I think that would be significant, absolutely. But as Danica mentioned, in terms of ethical responsibilities and wanting to support the young people as much as possible, I think it would have been an ideal to do so if we were able to conduct in-person interviews and to be able to support in a more one-on-one scenario researcher participant relationship to ensure that they were well supported in terms of their mental health concerns or any possible implications that may stem from their participation in the interview itself. So that definitely was part of the rationale or concerns that we had as we made decisions about the age for this initial project. Absolutely, but definitely, recognizing the distinctions there, and with the benefit of time, maturity, as well as life experience, as Danica said, having the adult perspective of a childhood's experience, I think was valuable to begin with, and then we can kind of work backwards from there as we go forward with an extension of this project.
Here we go. And there was a question about the children's rights, the ones you chose and why you chose those, and whether others that could have been, relevant as well. Some Convention on the Rights of the Child articles refer to the role of parents more specifically. Any thoughts about that, about the choice of articles?
I think there were several reasons. One being feasibility, logistics, and also I think accessibility. We didn't want the survey, especially, to be overwhelming for the young people. It was already long enough to begin with, and so we had to be selective about specific rights that we felt were perhaps ones that would resonate more with the young people, or at least have this, initial opening and conversation and feedback from them. That said, some of these particular articles or rights were focused on within the Parents Project as well. So there was somewhat of an extension on the emphasis on children's rights to be heard, as well as their rights to support. And so in the pilot study, we focused on parents' perspectives, and this second study or extension allowed us to hear from the young people themselves about those specific rights. So we certainly wanted to ensure some alignment between the two studies to begin with. We do recognize, and I agree, Kathy, with your comment and your question with respect to other ones that, in some ways responsibilize parents. And we did explore that more in the parent study, but certainly going forward, we'll expand on the range of rights that we can focus on and have kind of extended conversations with both the young people as well as the parents and anyone else who may be implicated. And there are many different populations that could be integrated within studies going forward in terms of like the wider family network with grandparents and cousins or other relatives who might be witnessing or be affected directly by the children's behavior, as well as support professionals. So definitely planning to take all those into consideration, but I don't know if Danica, if there was anything else you wanted to share in that regard.
No, I think that really covers it for sure. And yeah, I think those specific, the right to be heard and to expression, and the right to treatment and support, it feels like those are also, from what we've heard and from the research too, just very relevant in terms of reasons for behavior and support needs. So I think those are definitely, like I said, relevant and important to explore. Although I agree with what Christine said, for sure, there's definitely more there that would be worthwhile and important to look into as well.
Then there's a question again pertaining to the slide. So I'm reading the question. I recall there was a slide regarding siblings' relationship to demonstrator. However, I don't recall information on the number of demonstrators that are adopted versus in care versus raised within the family of origin. Was that info available?
Sure. So in the surveys, again, in order to kind of keep things somewhat brief and not too lengthy, we wanted to make sure that it was not a super long survey and it was really accessible to the participants. We focused a lot on kind of the nature of behavior, the impacts, kind of the reasons what was going on, the children's rights aspects of it. And in the interviews is where we wanted to, or we're more able to provide more space for people to share about those kinds of details. So we definitely have those details for the interview participants. Unfortunately, we only had 3 interview participants who were demonstrators of APFEA. So in terms of kind of making generalizations or things like that from that, it's definitely more, yeah, it's not a huge number. For siblings, it was kind of, we were more able to ask those questions on the survey. But yeah, so we have those details for the interviews for demonstrators. And they were kind of, it was not necessarily straightforward. One was adopted and then also experienced time in group homes or institutional care. The other 2 had biological, they were with family of origins and then in kinship care and then eventually on their own. So those are those details for the interviews.
There's another question again about the participants and, you know, in or out of child welfare. And did you find that responses were different for participants who were not in child welfare versus those who were in child welfare system?
Yeah, so I think I won't make necessarily generalizations because we don't have specific data really that can completely speak to that. We definitely heard a lot of stories and reflections about difficulties with the child welfare system and difficulties in whether it was institutional care or difficulties with child welfare agencies. So we definitely heard a lot about that. But there's, in terms of comparing kind of those in child welfare, those in who weren't involved in the system, I don't think we can completely speak to that, but there were still, I will say as well, and as we kind of mentioned in the presentation, there were definitely difficulties in biological, in homes where participants were with biological families. So definitely, yeah, for sure, difficulties and challenges all around.
Thanks, Danica, for that. I don't know, Elisa, did you want to say something? It was just, no, okay, that's good. So I don't see other questions. However, I see thank yous here. Thank you on behalf of the National Consortium on APFEA for doing this important research and for providing such strong leadership in understanding APFEA from a child rights approach. It's a unique perspective in the growing body of research on APFEA. It's a critical one, and I agree with that. And another thank you and encouraging you to publish this in somewhere like the conversation. That's I think that would be you know, reaching a wider audience. That's a definitely something you should think about. Are there any other questions? Do I see any other questions?
I think there was just one earlier on about the slide deck. And this will be, this has been recorded as, right, and it will be posted just to
yes, the availability of the present. So the presentation is being recorded, and I'm sorry, I should have probably said that at the beginning of the meeting, and it completely slipped my mind. It is being recorded and it will be posted on our, we have a YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find the link on our website, the LRIDE website. So that's,
and I would add if I may too, yes, in terms of the slide deck itself, I think that would be featured within the audio-visual recording, but much of what we've shared here today is also featured in various ways within the reports and the summary poster that Danica had mentioned, and that's available on the Adopt for Life website. And so I think the links have been posted into the chat. I do see another question that I don't think we've addressed, and it's by Gwyn, and it's asking about whether we have thoughts on how to ensure children's service providers can become APFEA informed. So I don't need to put Elise on the spot, but I think that may be one where she may be able to share if there's something else you wanted to share at the moment, as I see her microphone is on.
Yeah, thank you for that one. Well, I think some of the suggestions that we've talked about today are totally in line with what we all need to do. We're exchanging ideas today. We're seeking out resources, and the National Consortium on APFEA would be a wonderful resource. Adopt for Life, the reports, maybe thinking about disseminating some of this work through the Conversation Canada. So what I would say is perhaps all of us taking it upon ourselves to seek out resources, to seek out trainings, to visit reputable websites and organizations, and just further our understanding of the topic would be an idea that I had. I think too that this work is completely in line with trauma-informed practices, and so an opportunity to advance our knowledge and our understanding in that area would fit very nicely with APFEA.
I have another, there's a comment here in the Q&A. If at any time in the future more research participants are needed for a study, Monica Ferenczi is open to sharing recruitment info with the client base, over 300 families. So there was a comment in case you were thinking of enlarging the the study. And so what are your next plans? That would be my question. What are you going to continue researching in this area, or a specific question, or what are you going to do with your research results other than what you already have? You've already published and posted.
Mm-hmm. I think, and I think I speak on behalf of Danica and Elisa as I shared this response, that I think we feel an obligation to both studies that we've completed so far, and there still remains quite a bit of data that we have not published on. We have a few other publications at various stages of progress that we're hoping to disseminate within child rights, or at least child and youth focused journals. So some academic articles are emerging from there, from the parents' perspectives, as well as ones that we hope to extend from this particular project. So there were, again, other themes that emerged from both studies with the parents as well as the young people that we think are worthy of expanding on and disseminating. So we'll continue to do that. So I think until some of that work is completed towards the end of this year, hopefully, then we'll look probably into the following year for any potential expansion. And I think, as I said earlier, certain individuals that we haven't consulted yet, so other young people within family settings, whether it be cousins or even beyond the family sphere, including friends or other observers, as well as other adult relatives, including grandparents, aunts and uncles, I think are certainly part of the kind of the wider experience. We know from speaking with parents that respite has been provided often by other relatives, whether it's grandparents or aunts and uncles. So to be able to hear their perspectives and the implications on the extended family and other sources of support that they're providing. So that's definitely, I think, our short-term as well as semi-long-term goals for now.
That's great. And there's also a note from Kathy Vandergood saying that it's important for the results, to reach also like teachers and all others who come into contact with these young people?
Yes, so similar to our previous family study that Elise and I worked on with young people who engaged in offending, we did provide different workshops to different stakeholders and professionals and practitioners across the education systems, the mental health care systems, the general health system, hospitals, as well as even within the criminal justice system, including police services, as well as lawyers. So that's definitely on our radar in terms of a wider dissemination, and even with social work services or child welfare support systems. And so that's definitely, we're planning to, again, ensure that it's as accessible as possible within the community. So not simply developing or disseminating the results within academic spaces, but definitely sharing them at a wider community level. And so the poster that Danica had created as more of a synopsis to the wider report, I know she took additional time to ensure that it was as youth-friendly as possible and as accessible to families. And so we definitely have that in mind, not only in terms of the delivery, but kind of the destinations or the locations where we can share those results.
Yeah, no, it's really great that you are, engaging in research that will potentially have a really concrete impact and hopefully will reach many people, and also for people who work in these areas with these families and with these young people to have also a better understanding of the children's rights impact. So having, adopting a child rights based approach to, service delivery and everything that's surrounding these people and families affected. So thank you for that. I don't see any more questions, just recognition that this is really important work. So yeah, I'll just reiterate that. And thank you for sharing that with us. I learned a lot. I think everybody might have seen in the chat there are links to our websites and how to follow us, the LRIDE, and get on our mailing list if you're not already. So I would encourage you to go and check those out. So thank you very much, Christine, Danica, and Elisa for this. It was a great session.
Thank you, Mona.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you again to Mona and all of the LRIDE community and committee and the wider support that we do receive from the Human Rights and Research and Education Center within the Faculty of Law at Ottawa U too, that supports all of our work collectively. So that's very much appreciated. And for all of you who took time out of your schedules to attend today, that's very meaningful. And as Elisa said, it's part of the collective responsibility that we all share to become more informed and to act on that new knowledge. So we look forward to any other suggestions that anyone may have in terms of not only dissemination, but engaging in more concrete actions to be as helpful as possible to the families and to the young people.
All right, thank you. So I think we'll end the session here. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.